Thank y'all for being here, and I'm glad we're able to get back and do this. Of course, we've all had these talks, but for a year now, but and this has kind of had to go on the back shelf, but we're finally getting to do it. And I ran across this when I was just doing a bunch of research on the United States Marshals and stuff, and I ran across about. Can y'all hear me all right? Okay. About Bass Reeves. He's a very interesting character. So I hope you enjoy this. Bass was born into slavery in Crawford County, Arkansas, in July 1838, and he was named after his grandfather, Bass Washington. And Bass, along with his family, were slaves in Arkansas, in the state of Arkansas, under the legislator William Reeves. When Bass was 9 years old, around 1846, they moved with William Reeves to Grayson County, Texas, which is up around, if you know where Sherman, Texas is, it's up around Sherman. And George Reeves, the son of William, joined the Confederate Army during the Civil War, and he took Bass with him. And at this point, nobody really knows that he kind of gained his freedom. It's not really clearly unknown if it's when he gained his freedom at this time, but one of the accounts indicate that he got in they were in a card game with George, and they got in an argument, and Bass pretty much, they got in a fight, and Bass whipped him, and he had to get out, and he had to get out, and so he went to Indian Territory, and he lived among the Creek Indians and the Seminoles, and he learned their language. And at this time, when the 13th Amendment came about in 1865, is when they figured that he was really cleared of his freedom and became free. And at this time, he went on to Van Buren, northeast of Fort Smith, Arkansas, and he got married to this gal by the name of Nellie Jamie, and together they had 11 children. And Bass worked with the U.S. Marshals at Fort Smith, and he was a good tracker. He was good with both pistol and rifle, good shot, and so he once bragged to people that he knew Indian Territory like a cook knew his kitchen. And when Judge Parker became judge of Fort Smith, I'm sure y'all have heard of Isaac Parker, known as the hanging judge. When he took over the federal court in 1875, he had noticed how Bass was, a good horseman, how he was good with weapons, and how he was a good scout, and how he knew the language of some of these different Indian tribes that were up in that area. And so he appointed him at this time the Deputy United States Marshal. Instead of just working with the Marshals as just a scout, he appointed him as a Marshal. He had this much respect for him after he saw what he could do. And he was one of these people that he was really had a coolness and a calmness, self-control, and he didn't fear anyone that he had to go up against to arrest. He stood about 6'2" and weighed about 185 pounds. He had the courage and strength and grit that it took to be a deputy U.S. Marshal in the most rough territory known at that time, the Indian Territory, which is now the state of Oklahoma. And if this reminds you of someone, and if you guessed John Wayne, you're correct. He had that type of correctness about him, and grit and courage that, that John Wayne showed his Rooster Cogburn, just go up against anybody. He never, one point about him, you would think as a United States Marshal that you'd have to know how to read and write. Bass never learned to read and write. Before he headed out on the trail to track them down, he would have someone read a lot of these warrants to him, and he would memorize it, who he had to go up against. And when he went to bring the men in, he'd bring them back one way or another, either alive or laid across the saddle. And during his career as a deputy marshal, I should have stapled these together. It's all right. Something else remarkable about him, when he went to serve these warrants, he always managed to hand out the correct one, even though he couldn't read. And as before, he mentioned that his marksmanship was good. He carried 2 pistols and a Winchester rifle. And most deputy U.S. Marshals at that time and Texas Rangers did carry 2 pistols, and a Bowie type knife and a rifle. It was just pretty standard gear for him. And he rode a big white horse, and he had at times he had a half-breed Indian scout go with him. This Indian scout was named Grant Johnson. A radio show was created in the 1930s about a masked man that had a Indian sidekick that rode with him. And in the 1950s, as you know, some of you have grown up, some of you may be, I think most people here probably remember these old westerns and stuff. He was one of my heroes, the Lone Ranger. And of course, he had Tonto with him. Both the Lone Ranger and Bass Reeves were disguise artists. A lot of times, Bass, he would disguise himself as something so he could catch his outlaws that he was going after. And I read at one point where he disguised himself as a bum, just a complete bum. Went up to a farmhouse and talked this lady into feeding him and everything like that, because he knew that she was the mother of the one he was after, and he eventually got the drop on him and got this guy. The Lone Ranger, if you'll remember, handed out silver bullets. Bass Reeves would hand out silver coins to help remember him. And this led some to believe that the Lone Ranger was created from Bass Reeves. I don't know. I mean, you can do research on it and see what you think, but I just think that, these similarities, how legends and things get started, I think that's how all this got started. Because one fact is, the Lone Ranger was a Texas Ranger, and Bass Reeves was a United States Marshal. So there's the difference in those. And he tricked a couple of Texas outlaws into thinking that he wasn't even a United States Marshal. And what you're about to hear, you might think you're watching just a good old Western movie, but it's fact. These 2 Texas lawbreakers, he came upon them, and one of them asked him if he was Bass Reeves, and he told them he wasn't, and they didn't really believe him, and they had him come along with them. And so after a while, they got tired of holding him hostage and everything like that, and they told him, "So get off your horse," they were going to kill him. And so he was sitting there, and they asked him, "So, well, do you have any last words?" and he just kind of nervously reached in his coat pocket, pulled out this paper and handed it to him. And he said that this was from his wife, and could you read it? Could you read it for me? Could you read it for me? So they started doing it, and when he took his eyes off of Bass and looked down to read this letter, Bass got the drop on him. And they taking the letter, and he just said, outlaws tried to take, and he wound up taking these two outlaws to court. And he did get those two back alive. He was dedicated to law enforcement, like a lot of them were. And he at one time was accused of murdering a cook, but he went before Judge Isaac Parker, and he acquitted him because he found out and realized that it was accidental killing, that Bass didn't mean to do it. And another point that shows that he was really dedicated to his work is one of his sons, Benny Reeves, murdered his wife, and he didn't hesitate. He went up and brought him in, and he served for 32 years as a United States Marshal for Judge Isaac Parker, and he was one of his most valued deputies, Judge Parker stated at one point. In bringing criminals in and felons, he arrested 3,000 during his career. He was never shot, killing about 14 outlaws, defending his life. After Oklahoma became a state in 1907, Bass Reeves now at 68, and he became a police officer for 2 years. After his retirement, Bass fell ill and died of Bright's disease on January the 12th, 1910. I don't know if y'all familiar with what Bright disease is. It's a kidney disease. It was the reason it's called Bright's disease. A researcher of different diseases, Richard Bright, came up with this kidney disease, and they call it Bright's disease. They don't call it that anymore. I can't remember exactly what to call it, but anyway. How we doing with time, Joyce? We're good? Okay. In doing research on him, there's a lot of research out there on Bass Reeves, and that you can find if you're more interested in this. And there's been a couple movies that have come out and documentaries that are on him. And I've got some other pictures I'm going to show you of Bass Reeves here. You can go ahead. Now this is a picture of Bass when he looked like a lot in his younger years. And then you can go to the next one. Okay, and this is what he was like in his later years, probably when he was working as a deputy in the police force. And you can see some others in the background there. These were deputies that were, working with him, or police officers. In the next picture, and there's a guy that does Bass Reeves, that portrays Bass Reeves. He goes around and talks to kids, and he goes around and talks to people dressed as Bass Reeves. And from what I haven't seen him, but from what I hear, he does a great job. I'd love to see him do this. Maybe Bob, maybe you can get him here sometime. Bob, maybe you can get this guy here, this guy that portrays Bass Reeves. Maybe you can get him here sometime. Okay, good. You heard that, the sergeant major. So let him know it. All right. And go to the next one. Okay, and here's a kind of a drawing or painting of Bass Reeves, what he probably looked like when he went out on the trail. And you can see his big white horse there.
Did he ride a white horse?
He did ride a white horse. Big white horse. And this is another picture of that guy that portrays Bass Reeves. But when I was doing this, there's so much more that I could put into this, but with our short amount of time, I didn't know exactly how much to do, so, huh? I still do, well. Yeah, we can take some questions, we can. And the movie, let me point this out. The movie that is out on Bass Reeves is called Hell on the Border. And what this refers to is the border of course, of Fort Smith, Arkansas, and Oklahoma. And I don't know how much research y'all have done on a lot of this, but I mean, it was a rough and wild place. At that time, people that were running from the law, instead of going to Mexico, a lot of them would go over to Oklahoma because it was still just a territory. And this is the reason that this United States Marshals they could go in there. They could go in there anyway. You know, they were allowed to go in there. So if anybody has any questions, I'll be happy to answer them for you. This is about all the information that I did get on Bass Reeves. Of course, there was a lot more, but